In the heart of the Arabian Peninsula, the desert doesn't forget. It doesn't speak in words, but in fossils, footprints, and winds that have carved the same dunes for tens of thousands of years. When we speak of Emirati DNA, we are not simply discussing ancestry. We are speaking of the oldest surviving pages in the story of humankind, written not in ink, but in flesh and lineage. Long before the concept of nations, long before flags or federations, this land bore witness to one of the most significant journeys in human history. Here, in what we now call the United Arab Emirates, ancient humans didn't just pass through. They paused, they settled, and in their bones, they left behind a record. Not myth, not oral tale, but genetic code, embedded deep within the cells of their descendants. Jebel Faya, nestled in modern-day Sharjah, holds clues that shook the world of archaeology. Stone tools found there, dated to over 125,000 years ago, matched those crafted in East Africa. For the first time, it wasn't Europe or the Levant that told the story of migration. It was this desert, this overlooked corner of the world that revealed humanity's earliest explorers may have crossed into Asia not through the north, but through here, the land we now call the UAE. And how did they arrive? Through the Bab el-Mandab Strait, a narrow, treacherous passage between the Horn of Africa and the Arabian coast. Some came northward through the Sinai. Others sailed across Red Sea currents, drawn by survival, curiosity, or something lost to time. And their genes, their bloodlines, laid roots here. We still see their traces. In the mitochondrial haplogroups, like L3, which connects modern Emiratis to ancient African maternal ancestors. In Y-DNA markers like EM35 and EM78, echoes of pastoralists who crossed deserts and planted the seeds of kinship. These aren't just statistics. They're coordinates, landmarks in the invisible geography of ancestry. But why does this matter? Because most people think of the UAE as a modern state, glass towers, oil wealth, and global business. Few know that beneath the skyline lies one of the most ancient, continuous threads of human history, a thread unbroken since the first humans left Africa. This is not a place that happened yesterday. This is one of the places where humanity began. And here's the paradox. The deeper we look into Emirati DNA, the clearer it becomes that this land was never peripheral. It was central, central to survival, central to movement, central to the formation of identities that would echo across millennia. So when we ask what makes Emirati DNA so unique, the answer starts here, with the dust of vanished footsteps, the tools of forgotten hands, and the unspoken memories carried quietly inside every Emirati family today. Because Emirati DNA doesn't just tell a story, it remembers it. Centuries before Dubai touched the sky, before the pearl divers of the Gulf descended into the depths, and before tribal banners flew over the dunes, this land had already become something far greater than itself. A mosaic, a convergence point, not of ideology, but of blood, of DNA. When you look into the genetic code of Emiratis, you aren't looking at a single origin. You're staring into the reflection of entire civilizations, layered like geological sediment, each one leaving behind fragments of its people. The Emirates sit at the intersection of 3 continents, and every ship, every caravan, every migration didn't just bring trade, it brought ancestry. We begin across the sea, with Persia. For thousands of years, merchants from the Iranian plateau crossed the Strait of Hormuz, anchoring in coastal markets from Ras Al Khaimah to Dubai. But their legacy wasn't just silk and saffron. It was alleles. Variants passed through generations, echoed today in the Emirati gene pool as distinct haplogroups of Western Asian origin. Not intrusions, contributions. Shift west, and you meet Africa, not in history books, but inside the genome. 2 distinct pulses of sub-Saharan African ancestry are etched into Emirati DNA. One, nearly 1,300 years ago, likely woven through trade and early Islamic expansion. The other, more recent, tied to the maritime slave trade between the 17th and 19th centuries. These events weren't just economic exchanges, they were human ones. Lives uprooted, stories displaced, and genes unavoidably shared. Yet the most dominant foreign thread doesn't come from the north or the west. It comes from the east, from the jagged coastlines of Balochistan, from the dry plains of Punjab, from the ancient cities of the industry. Genetic analysis reveals that over 50% of Emirati autosomal ancestry links back to Central and South Asia. A statistic? Maybe. But it's also a whisper from ancient Balochi traders, Pathan laborers, Sindhi sailors, people who crossed the Arabian Sea not just for commerce, but for permanence. You see it most clearly in maternal lineages. Mitochondrial haplogroups like R2 plus 13500, common in Rajasthan and Balochistan, still circulate among Emirati women today. Not metaphorically, literally. That means that somewhere deep in the maternal line, a woman, maybe veiled, maybe barefoot, left her homeland and never returned. Her daughters, and their daughters, would one day call the Emirates home. Even European ancestry finds its place. A G6PD deficiency variant, traced to Mediterranean populations, exists today in Emirati genomes. How did it get here? Possibly through ancient Levantine commerce. Possibly through Roman-era intermediaries. Possibly through routes now lost beneath modern borders. But it came, and it stayed. All of this adds up to one undeniable truth. Emirati DNA is not pure in the traditional sense. It is purely hybrid. It is not a single story. It is the harmony of many. Arabia may be its heart, but Asia is its rhythm, Africa its pulse, and the Mediterranean its echo. And here lies the irony. For people often defined by lineage, by tribe, by purity of descent, the genome tells a story of mixture, of blending. Not dilution, but evolution. So the next time someone draws a boundary, remember, the blood of the Emirates crossed every one of them centuries ago. In the Emirates, identity doesn't begin with a name. It begins with a tribe. It's not just who you are. It's who your ancestors stood beside when the wind turned harsh and water ran dry. Tribal identity isn't a cultural artifact here. It's the architecture of belonging. And for centuries, that architecture was enforced not with ink, but with blood. Across the 7 Emirates, the desert wasn't the only barrier, so were the lines drawn by family. Lines that governed who you could love, who you could marry, and ultimately, how your DNA would evolve. In Emirati society, endogamy, marrying within one's tribe or extended family, wasn't tradition. It was necessity, a way to protect alliances, consolidate land, and ensure that honor stayed exactly where it belonged, within the lineage. But nature never forgets the cost of repetition. Over half of all Emirati marriages today still occur between relatives, cousins, second cousins, even closer. And each of those unions strengthens not just the family tree, but the genetic echo chamber it creates. Scientists call this consanguinity. In the lab, it translates to elevated homozygosity, identical copies of genes inherited from both parents. In life, it means a higher chance of rare genetic conditions surfacing, sometimes generation after generation. Yet the consequences aren't just medical. They're genetic signatures, forged in isolation. Within different Emirati tribes, entire clusters of DNA have formed, unique enough that researchers can often identify someone's tribal background just by analyzing their genome. You aren't just from Abu Dhabi or Fujairah. Your DNA carries the coordinates of your ancestors' tents, their wells, their mountains, their oases. In these tight-knit groups, what emerges is something called the founder effect. Imagine a tribe where, centuries ago, a handful of individuals carried a rare genetic variant. As the group remained isolated and married internally, that variant became more common, not because it offered an advantage, but because the gene pool never expanded. Over time, it becomes a part of that tribe's identity. That's how certain rare conditions, like beta thalassemia or metabolic disorders, became statistically more prevalent among specific Emirati families. But this isn't just a story of limitations. It's a story of survival under harsh constraints. In a land where famine, drought, and disease could wipe out entire settlements, knowing your kin meant knowing who would fight for you, who would share their food, who would carry your child if you died. Genetics was never the goal. It was the byproduct of trust, of survival strategy, of lineage loyalty. The irony is profound. The very mechanisms that have preserved such rich and traceable genetic heritage are also the ones that carry risk in the modern world. Diseases that were once hidden now rise with clarity, revealed by the very tools of science that seek to heal them. But that clarity also brings power. Power to map disorders, to intervene early, and to design treatments tailored not just to a population, but to the tribe, to the family, to the individual. And perhaps that's the deeper truth of Emirati DNA. It doesn't just remember who you are. It holds the map of who you were allowed to be. Marriage wasn't merely personal, it was political. Every union was a vote cast for continuity. Every child born was a new verse in an old tribal poem, recited across time through chromosomes instead of stanzas. So next time you hear someone say, "We are one people," look closer. Beneath that unity lies 1,000 carefully preserved boundaries. Boundaries that didn't divide, they defined. Some legacies are carved into stone. Others are passed through stories. But the most unbreakable ones are carried silently, inside the body, encoded in molecules of defense. The Emirati genome carries one of the Middle East's most intricate immune blueprints. And at its core lies a code of resilience, the HLA system. The human leukocyte antigen, HLA, isn't just another genetic marker. It's the body's early warning system, a microscopic radar that scans every cell, every virus, every invader, and decides in a split second whether it belongs or must be destroyed. And in Emiratis, this system tells a story of centuries of biological warfare fought in silence. When researchers analyzed the HLA alleles of 200 unrelated Emirati families, a remarkable pattern emerged. A handful of gene variants were doing something unusual. They weren't just frequent, they were dominant. HLA-02, DRB103, DQB1*02. These weren't random genetic accidents. They were survivors, variants that had, over generations, helped fight off pathogens common to the region's harsh environments. Desert living isn't just about braving the sun or finding water. It's about facing microbial enemies, shaped by heat, dust, and scarcity. Every fever survived, every wound that healed without infection, every child who lived past infancy. Those victories were silently recorded in the immune genes passed on. Over time, certain HLA combinations didn't just offer better protection. They became the biological signature of survival. But resilience has a cost. Some of these same alleles are now linked to autoimmune disorders. The very genes that once made ancestors resistant to ancient diseases may now contribute to modern conditions like type 1 diabetes or celiac disease. It's a paradox. What once saved lives can now complicate them. Evolution doesn't think in terms of comfort. It only calculates odds of survival. Yet even in complexity, there is clarity. Extended HLA haplotypes, entire sequences inherited together, are unusually well preserved in the Emirati population. In other parts of the world, these patterns are fragmented, scattered by centuries of mixing. But here, due to tightly knit tribal structures and generations of endogamy, these haplotypes remain intact, like untouched scrolls preserved in a genetic library. One 5-locus haplotype, A26C07B08, DRB103DQB1*02, is found at a frequency that would be rare elsewhere, but is common among Emiratis. It's more than a cluster of letters and numbers. It's a story, a specific sequence that may trace back to a single ancestor, hundreds of years ago, whose descendants continue to survive, to multiply, to adapt. And it's not just about history. These immune codes are now becoming critical tools in medicine. From bone marrow matches to organ transplants, from vaccine responsiveness to risk prediction, understanding a person's HLA makeup can mean the difference between life and death. That's why researchers are investing in population-specific HLA databases, because what works in Europe or America won't always apply here. This is especially urgent in the Emirates, where the frequency of rare and population-specific alleles complicates medical compatibility. One-size-fits-all medicine no longer works, and the solution doesn't lie in importing data. It lies in decoding what's already here, within the people. In a world moving rapidly toward personalized healthcare, Emirati HLA data isn't just valuable. It's essential. It offers a map not just of past epidemics, but of future treatments. Because every immune gene tells a dual story, of what was once endured and what might still be overcome. It began with a single drop of blood, silent, colorless, unremarkable. But within that drop, entire empires slept. Ancient ancestors waited to be named, and the future of medicine, in a region once dismissed as a genetic mystery, finally opened its eyes. The Emirati Genome Program is not just a scientific project. It's a declaration that the history of a people is not complete until their DNA speaks. And now, it's speaking louder than ever. Launched as one of the world's most ambitious national sequencing efforts, the program set out with a bold vision: to decode the full genome of every Emirati citizen willing to participate. Not a sample, not a percentage, a nationwide mirror reflecting back millennia of survival, adaptation, and inheritance. As of early 2025, over 700,000 individual genomes have been sequenced. But what makes this data extraordinary isn't its scale, it's what it reveals. For the first time, scientists were able to reconstruct a genetic landscape that had, until now, only been glimpsed through fragmentary studies. And what they found wasn't a single population, but a network of ancestral threads, some local, others crossing oceans, deserts, and forgotten borders. The results shattered assumptions. While regional ancestry was expected, the proportions defied conventional narratives. Approximately 54% of Emirati genetic ancestry tied to Central and South Asia, 37% to Middle Eastern lineages, with traces from Europe and sub-Saharan Africa woven in faint but undeniable strands. These weren't speculative guesses. They were anchored in entire genomes, line by line, base by base. But ancestry is only one layer. The real power lies in the variation. Among the millions of variants detected, over 230 were found to be entirely absent in global databases like ClinVar. These are not academic curiosities. Many are directly linked to conditions that disproportionately affect Emiratis: hypertension, type 2 diabetes, rare metabolic syndromes, and congenital blood disorders. In the past, treatment protocols were borrowed from Western models. Today, the script is being rewritten in native code. The Genome Program is not a relic hunting expedition. It is precision engineering for healthcare. A quiet revolution where medicine no longer generalizes, but listens. Where a newborn's DNA can warn of a disease 10 years before symptoms surface. Where pharmaceutical choices can be tailored to the enzymes and proteins unique to Emirati physiology. This is what genomic sovereignty looks like. And the deeper researchers look, the more patterns emerge. Variants once dismissed as noise are now seen as coordinates, marking ancient migration routes, tribal divides, and even specific emirates with distinct genomic profiles. In some cases, a variant common in one tribe is entirely absent in another, just 150 kilometers away. The landscape isn't flat. It's a genetic topography shaped by centuries of settlement, marriage, and migration. What the program is doing isn't just scientific. It's archival. It's as if every family tree, every whispered memory, every untold migration has been encoded, waiting for a machine to read it and a human to interpret it. And what emerges is clear. Emirati DNA cannot be fully understood unless it is studied on its own terms, not compared to Europeans, not modeled on Levantines, but analyzed as a system evolved in this geography, shaped by this climate, and embedded in this culture. This is more than data collection. This is a national awakening, a statement that genetic heritage is not a curiosity, it's a living asset. Because when you read your past at the molecular level, you don't just learn who you were. You begin to see who you're becoming. Stand at the shores of the Arabian Gulf, and it's easy to believe you're looking at a place defined by its neighbors. To the west, the Arabian heartlands. To the north, the mountains of Persia. To the east, the Indian subcontinent. Cultures have passed through here like monsoon winds, visible, loud, unforgettable. But when scientists peer beyond culture, beyond language and dress, into the DNA of the Emirati people, they find something far more surprising. They find distance. Not physical distance, but genetic. A subtle, silent divergence that separates Emiratis even from those they've traded with, lived beside, or prayed alongside for centuries. A divergence built not by oceans, but by history's quietest architects: isolation. The largest HLA family genetic study ever conducted on Emiratis revealed something astonishing. While they share linguistic, religious, and cultural ties, with Levantine Arabs, Iranians, and East Mediterranean communities. Their genes stand apart. Phylogenetic dendrograms, the genetic family trees, place them closer to Saudis, Omanis, North Africans, and even some South Asian populations. But consistently and conclusively, they remain distant from Iranian, Kurdish, Turkish, and Levantine groups. This isn't intuitive. Geographically, the Emirates sit just across from southern Iran. But genetically, they drift like an island. How did this happen? Part of the answer lies in the way Emirati society preserved itself. While many neighboring populations experienced waves of intermarriage across cultural and linguistic lines, especially through conquest and empire, Emirati tribes maintained a tight grip on lineage. Marriages occurred within defined tribal frameworks. Population flow was limited, even when external trade thrived. So while goods, languages, and architecture crossed borders, deep genetic mixing did not. This isolation wasn't total, but it was enough. Enough to preserve a unique constellation of haplotypes, allele frequencies, and linkage disequilibrium values rarely seen elsewhere in the region. In simple terms, the genetic accent of Emiratis remained distinct, even as the world around them changed. But isolation alone doesn't explain the full picture. Another factor is historical timing. Genetic distance often reflects not just who mixed with whom, but when. The Arab migrations that heavily impacted the Levant and parts of North Africa during the 7th to 11th centuries left deep genetic imprints. Yet studies show these migrations had a relatively muted effect on the Emirati genome. Instead, Emirati DNA retains a stronger signal from pre-Islamic Arabian populations and earlier waves of migration, including those tied to ancient Afro-Asian corridors. So what you see in modern Emiratis is not a hybrid between Arab and Persian, or Arab and Levantine. You see an older, more preserved core, one that shares roots with the tribes that roamed the peninsula long before maps, long before kingdoms, long before oil. And yet, even this core is not homogeneous. Genetic data shows microvariations between Emirates, between mountain tribes, oasis dwellers, island communities. A person from Fujairah might carry different ancestral markers than someone from Liwa. Not dramatically, but enough to remind us that even within isolation, complexity persists. Like dialects evolving under the same flag, this genetic distinctiveness has profound implications. It means that while Emiratis may share language and faith with their neighbors, their biology tells a different tale. A tale of retention, of continuity unbroken by external pressures. It explains why disease profiles here differ, why certain treatments fail, why health initiatives must be written in a local dialect of DNA. But beyond medicine, there's something poetic about it. In a region where so much has changed, borders redrawn, identities reinvented, the Emirati genome stands like an undisturbed archive. It carries within it memories older than mosques, older than palaces. It is not Arab in the pan-nationalist sense, not Persian by proximity. It is uniquely, stubbornly Emirati, not because it chose to be different, but because, across centuries of change, it chose to remain true. Look closely at a fingerprint under a microscope. No two are alike, not even in the same family. And just like that, when you zoom in on the DNA of the Emirates, what once appeared unified reveals a hidden tapestry. Not a single genetic identity, but a chorus of regional variations, distinct, intricate, and astonishingly preserved. This isn't merely a nation of shared flags and borders. It's a landscape of micropopulations shaped by terrain, tradition, and time. From the granite ridges of Hajar to the coastal inlets of Amalquain, each region has sculpted its people in quiet, genetic ways that most would never see unless they knew where to look. Modern genome mapping has allowed researchers to do exactly that. And what they've uncovered inside the Emirati population isn't simplicity. It's complexity etched into every cell. Start in the mountains. The highlands of Ras Al Khaimah and Fujairah fostered isolated communities, tribes that lived apart from the trading ports and migratory flows of the coast. In these elevated enclaves, generations intermarried within limited circles, giving rise to unique founder mutations. These aren't just rare variants, they're time capsules. Sequences found almost nowhere else on Earth, shaped by altitude, isolation, and ancestral resilience. Then shift to the oases. Al Ain, for example, was more than a lifeline in the desert. It was a hub, a place where caravans paused, where people from different tribes and even distant regions converged, if only briefly. This subtle mixing left fingerprints too, more genetic diversity, a broader spread of mitochondrial lineages, and variants reflecting old trade ties with the interior of Arabia. Move farther west, to Liwa and the Empty Quarter, and the genetic story changes again. Here, Bedouin traditions reigned. Nomadic families roamed vast distances, but rarely crossed marriage boundaries. Despite the openness of the desert, these communities maintained strict social boundaries. The DNA here reflects that tension, mobility in geography, stability in bloodline. Along the coast, a different rhythm took hold. Cities like Dubai and Sharjah were maritime gateways, open to sailors, merchants, pilgrims. While tribal identity still guided social structure, the gene flow was more fluid. Mitochondrial markers from East Africa and South Asia appear more frequently here than inland, the echo of generations born from cross-cultural unions at the edge of the sea. Even the islands, like Serbani Yas or Dalma, carried their own genetic legacy. Small populations, limited external contact. Over time, these communities developed distinct allele frequencies, particularly in genes associated with metabolic processes and immune response, likely shaped by unique environmental pressures such as diet, isolation, and localized disease exposure. But perhaps the most remarkable discovery is that all these differences, these regional fingerprints, haven't dissolved into one another. They persist, despite rapid modernization, despite intermarriage across Emirates, despite urbanization and the rise of a national identity. The genetic boundaries, laid down over centuries, have proven durable. What does this mean for science? It means that population-based medicine in the UAE cannot rely on a single genetic profile. It means that two Emiratis, born within hours of each other, just a few hundred kilometers apart, might have completely different responses to the same drug, might carry different risks, might require different screening protocols. Medicine here must be local not just in language, but in genome. And what does it mean for culture? It means that under the shared Emirati identity lies something even deeper, a biological record of how diverse paths once coexisted, separately, yet side by side. A nation not built on erasure, but on preservation, on the decision to hold tight to tradition while time moved forward. Because in the Emirates, identity is not just a matter of where you're from. It's how you're from there. Mountain blood runs differently than island blood. Coastal genes carry different memories than desert ones. And when all these legacies finally came together under one flag, they didn't blur, they stood, proudly distinct. A fingerprint of civilization, pressed deep into the genome, and now finally seen.